Dr. Ovadia, it's great to see you again, and it's great to have you here.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. Thank you, Ryan. Great to be here with you, and great to be here with the audience on all the channels. Really, excited about what you guys are doing at metabolichealth.com. And ultimately, the mission that we're all on is to get the confusion out of health, to get the good information in the hands, in the minds of the people that need it. And that's a big task to accomplish, but I'm confident that we are going to be able to turn the tide on nutrition and health, because as we know, the trajectory that we're on regarding health here in the United States and worldwide is not sustainable, and we need to turn this ship around. And this is exactly the way that we're going to be able to do that.
Excellent, excellent. Well, we're very excited to partner with you on this, and we hope this is educational for all of those who are tuning in. Today, we're going to be focusing this conversation on a number of health myths that pervade society. Now, these are myths that folks across the country and really across the world, sadly, and to their detriment, have been basing their health decisions on. Now, we only have 30 minutes with Dr. Ovadia, and we're hoping we can cover at least 3 myths today. If we have time for maybe one more, we could try to squeeze it in. But I guess without further ado, let's dive into the first one. How does that sound, Dr. Ovadia?
Sounds great.
All right, so the first one is kind of a 2-for-1. It's one myth, but it's kind of 2 parts, and so that is number one, or the first part is meat is bad for your health, and the second one is saturated fat clogs arteries. And I combine these two into one because oftentimes a lot of people who say meat is bad for you will justify it by saying saturated fat clogs arteries. So we wanted to get your reaction to this, help us understand why this is a myth.
Yeah, sure thing. So, this really goes back to the diet heart hypothesis, as it's been called. And, it's important that we emphasize the hypothesis part of that, because this is and was a theory that was first really brought to prominence in the 1950s by a scientist by the name of Ansel Keys. And the diet heart hypothesis has 2 parts to it. One is that the fat that we consume in our diet leads to alterations in our blood cholesterol levels, and that those blood cholesterol levels then are the main influencer of the development of heart disease. And saturated fat, in particular, was demonized and was hypothesized to be what was driving the heart disease epidemic that we started to really pay attention to back in the 1950s. And the problem is that neither side of that equation has really ever been proven to be true. The relationship between dietary fat and dietary saturated fat in particular, and blood cholesterol levels, is variable. In some people, excessive consumption of saturated fat can cause certain of the cholesterol particles that we measure with the blood tests, LDL in particular, to go up. But that's an inconsistent relationship, and it's probably an inconsequential relationship. When you look at the amount of cholesterol that is in our bloodstream and in our bodies at any one time, and you compare it to the amount of cholesterol that we actually get from our diets, they're orders of magnitude different. So that part of the hypothesis doesn't really hold up. And then the relationship between elevated blood cholesterol levels, specifically, LDL cholesterol levels, which are what are most focused on, and the development of atherosclerosis in the arteries of the heart. Again, is a very loose at best relationship. And the reality is that I would put forward that it's really not a predictor of cardiovascular disease, or it's a very weak predictor of cardiovascular disease at best. And we have much bigger dietary factors that we can point to when it comes to the development of heart disease. As you then said, red meat was villainized based solely on the saturated fat argument. And again, we have a problem here because it turns out that red meat, in many instances, isn't actually even that high in saturated fat. There are a lot of other things in the diet that might be even higher in saturated fat that are not demonized. You can look at something like coconut oil, which is almost universally felt to be a health promoting product. And yet the percentage of saturated fat in coconut oil is much higher than it is in red meat. So, we see all these inconsistencies around this. And when you look at the totality of the data, and there was a very large kind of, meta-analysis collection of studies that was looked at, now goes back about 3 or 4 years, that they, looked at all of the evidence between red meat consumption and heart disease, and they found that there was basically no linkage there. There were only weak epidemiologic associations, but no direct causative thing that you can point to. And saturated fat as well. We have now had multiple meta-analyses and multiple studies that have shown that there is no relationship between saturated fat intake and the development of heart disease, or really any other health problem that you can point to. Red meat has also been linked to things like cancer and kidney disease. And again, the totality of the evidence debunks all of those claims. So, I circle back to the kind of basics, and the basics are this. We have been eating red meat for our entire existence as human beings. It is likely the food that allowed us to evolve as human beings, and therefore it would make no sense that it was damaging to our health. And we can then just look at, recent evidence. And the recent evidence here in the United States is that our consumption of red meat has gone down by about 40% since 1950. And heart disease has continued to skyrocket. And even beyond heart disease, our overall health, when we look at things like diabetes, cancer, all of these chronic diseases have continued to go up while our consumption of red meat has gone down. So it really makes no sense, even on those epidemiological levels that, nutritionists love so much, to try and implicate red meat as damaging to our health.
Yeah, no, that's extremely interesting, Dr. Ovadia. I would say, people who, doctors and scientists that might disagree with you, they typically do rely on some sort of evidence in terms of scientific studies. But I've heard many folks, and I've done my own research here, that I think some of those studies that they like to cite are pretty shoddy. Would you like to comment on maybe some of the problems with some of the evidence that these saturated fat causes heart disease proponents might use as the basis for their arguments?
Yeah, so again, it's largely based on epidemiologic data, which is basically looking at population-wide consumption of foods and trying to link it to health outcomes. And we know that that scientific method cannot prove causation. It can only be used to demonstrate association. And the confounding factor that often comes into play in these studies is that because red meat has been so villainized when it comes to health, people who are consuming red meat are oftentimes doing other things that are not beneficial to their health. So things like, more common to be a smoker if you're eating red meat, less prone to exercise to adequate levels if you're consuming red meat, more likely to drink alcohol, those types of things. The other problem we run into is the way that red meat is usually consumed. And here in the United States, if someone has said that they've eaten red meat, it is highly likely that it is being combined with processed foods. It is likely to be a hamburger, for instance, that's going to have a bun and toppings and be consumed with French fries and soda. If you're having your steak, it's highly likely, that you're having the side dishes with that may be highly processed and consume other things that we know to be bad for our health. So truly isolating out the effects of red meat becomes very difficult, quite honestly, to do from a scientific standpoint. And, that's why I don't really stand up and say, oh, I have all the evidence that I need that, red meat is good for our health. I just say we have very little evidence that would support that it's bad for our health. And then I rely on my clinical experience with, numerous patients now and a large community of people that have seen their health dramatically improve when they go to eating essentially nothing besides red meat. That to me is the most powerful evidence. And we continue to accumulate that evidence.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting line of questioning there as well, because you've got the heart surgery practice, so you're actually operating on people and cutting people open, people who have heart disease, and then on the other side of it, you have a practice that focuses on metabolic health, where you're trying to prevent people from needing heart surgery. So I guess you have a pretty nice sample size of folks that you've talked to in the past. What have been some of those conversations that you've had? Have you noticed any sort of patterns with patients in terms of what their diet looks like and what kind of health problems they might have?
Yeah, so on the heart surgery side of things, the very consistent pattern that I see is that patients who end up with atherosclerotic heart disease, blockages in the arteries of their heart, are almost universally insulin resistant. Sometimes obviously so, they're diabetic and they have obvious markers of insulin resistance. Sometimes not obviously so. And so most doctors, because they don't really test for insulin resistance and don't really think about insulin resistance, they miss that signal. But we actually have very good data work from Gerald Reven back in really the 1970s and 1980s showed that almost universally, like in excess of 95% of patients that present with heart disease, with heart attacks, are insulin resistant if you test for it properly. Now you can contrast that to elevated LDL cholesterol levels, and again, the data that we have show that really only about half of the patients that present with heart attacks or clinical heart disease have elevated LDL cholesterol levels. So you can see the difference in the magnitude of the relationship. And then what I see in my preventative health practice now is when patients focus on insulin resistance, when they, do the dietary changes that help to improve and reverse their insulin resistance, we are now seeing the progression of their heart disease stops. And in some cases, we even see some reversal of heart disease. But for the most part, our focus is on stopping the progression of heart disease so it doesn't continue to the point where you need to end up on my operating table. And, when you make the dietary and lifestyle interventions that will reverse your insulin resistance, that is a very reliable way to stop the progression of heart disease.
That's great. I think we, looking at the time here, we should probably move on to number 2. Ryan, do you want to take that one?
Yep. So great line of inquiry there. And you touched upon this a bit in your initial answer. For many, many years, there's been a narrative surrounding cardiovascular health concerning LDL cholesterol, or cholesterol even more broadly. And in many people's mind, there is a fear of cholesterol that perhaps isn't warranted based on properly conducted studies determining whether this is actually something that contributed to a heart attack in the end. Would you be able to speak a little bit about LDL cholesterol and maybe its role in the body and help people to have more of a subtle understanding of this element in our human body?
Yeah, so LDL cholesterol, and to kind of really set the basics that people might not fully understand, and quite frankly, most people's doctors may not be able to explain to them well. LDL is a what we call a lipoprotein. It is a carrier for cholesterol. So cholesterol being a fatty substance, will not dissolve into the bloodstream. Your blood is basically made of water, and anyone that has tried to put oil in water know that they don't mix. So we need a way to carry the cholesterol through our bloodstream, and LDL is one of the ways that we do that. It's what's called the lipoprotein. Um, the when we go back to some of the early foundations about the study of heart disease, and we can go back to the Framingham study for this. What was demonstrated was that excessively high levels of total cholesterol, and then as we got better at measuring cholesterol, we kind of pivoted to LDL cholesterol. And so excessive high levels were demonstrated to be associated with increased risk of heart disease. And the confounding factor in those studies is that what we didn't understand back when the studies were being done, but we now understand now, is that most of those people that they were picking up probably had genetic alterations in their cholesterol, what we call familial hypercholesterolemia, that doesn't only affect their cholesterol levels, but it also has other effects, including affecting their propensity to blood clotting. And the incidence in heart disease may have been more related to that blood clotting issue than to the cholesterol itself. But anyway, what I try to get people to understand and focus on today is that it's really not the amount of cholesterol that we should be concerned about. It's the quality of the cholesterol in your bloodstream that we should be concerned about. And this is where, again, we get into things like insulin resistance and its effects on cholesterol molecules, on these lipoproteins. Because what insulin resistance does is it makes your lipoproteins, your LDL in particular, more likely to be small, dense particles. And these small, dense particles are the kind of sticky ones. They're the damaged ones that end up getting trapped into the blood vessel wall. The reason that LDL goes to the blood vessel wall to start with, and this is another important concept, is because there has been damage to that blood vessel wall. We have cholesterol. These lipid lipoprotein particles are in our bloodstream from birth until death. And why do they only sometimes start to build up in the wall of the blood vessel? And the answer is that the blood vessel wall needs to be damaged in the first place, because if it's not, these particles don't pass through the lining of the blood wall or won't stay in there. They can kind of go in and out of the bloodstream, but they won't get stuck in the blood vessel wall and start to accumulate in these plaques unless the blood vessel itself is damaged and the cholesterol particles become damaged. So, when it comes to the cholesterol issue, what I try and get people to understand is we really should be looking at the quality of your cholesterol, not the quantity of your cholesterol. This is going to get into things like particle sizes. And this is where you need a doctor, a practitioner who really understands these nuances about cholesterol, as opposed to just looking at one number on a basic lipid panel and believing that reliably predicts your risk of heart disease.
So, Dr. Ovadia, I think that is a perfect segue into the third myth that we have, which is your doctor knows what he's talking about. What's your reaction to that myth?
Yeah, my reaction to that myth is that you can't assume that. We have to recognize that the educational system for physicians, for doctors, has been corrupted, and there's a large influence of things like the pharmaceutical industry and the food industry on that educational environment. And then when doctors get out into practice, again, they're bombarded with messaging that comes from the pharmaceutical industry primarily. And so, they are only presented with one side of the information in many cases. And it's up to them. It was up to me to get outside of that information environment and to educate myself about, all of the things that we've talked about today. And most physicians don't have the time to do that. We have gotten to a point where most physicians are so busy taking care of sick people that they don't have the time to step back and say, why are all these people so sick in the first place? And what can we be doing better to really reverse their illness as opposed to just trying to manage it with medications and things like that.
I've heard you on previous broadcasts and podcasts that you've done with other folks say that if your doctor isn't serving you, you should either get a new doctor or challenge them to do better. I'm curious, have you seen patients successfully be able to challenge their doctor to do better? And I know I'm coming at this from a pretty cynical perspective. I've had some bad experiences with doctors in the past. What's your reaction to that? Have you seen that before?
Yeah. So ultimately, when I look at the physicians who, have sort of come into this metabolic space, the metabolic health world, they usually have one of two stories. It's either that they came at it like I did because of their own personal health challenges, or they had a patient who, kind of brought this to them, and they saw the results of that patient and started to question, why that occurred, even though this went against, kind of all of the stuff that they had learned. So I do believe that doctors can be influenced by their patients, but it's a small percentage, I'll say. A lot of doctors aren't open to that. Just can't believe that all of the dogma and everything that they've always believed might not be the whole truth. So it's difficult, but it's not impossible. And in the end, I am encouraged. I am hopeful, and this will be a great way to sort of wrap this up on a positive note. That the metabolic health space among physicians, among practitioners, is growing. And when I go to the meetings, I see more and more practitioners from more and more different specialties that are waking up to this reality and trying to do a better job for their patients. Ultimately, I think that's what all of us in the metabolic health space, all of the practitioners are trying to do. We are not satisfied with the results that we have been getting for our patients under the traditional approach. And so we've started to look for alternatives. We come to metabolic health and we see the true improvements in people's health that occur from focusing on this. And that's why we want to then amplify that message, bring it to more of our patients, and continue to grow this community.
That's great. Yeah. And so many people have lost loved ones to heart disease. So it's such an important topic. And the breakthroughs, it seems like, are really in the details, understanding each patient's personal condition. So we really appreciate you coming on and helping educate us on some more of those subtleties. Just in closing, Dr. Ovadia, we were curious, for people interested in learning more about your mission and your practice, and just the help that you're able to provide people. What are some of the best channels or places for people to connect with you and learn more?
Yeah, so ifixhearts.com is the website. You'll find all of my information there. For those of us that are in the Twitter space, here I am at ifixhearts on Twitter. That's probably the social channel that I'm most active on. You can find me on Instagram and YouTube. I think we have some YouTube listeners or watchers as well. So you can flip over to my YouTube channel over at ifixhearts. And the book that I wrote now almost 2 years ago is Stay Off My Operating Table. I host a podcast by the same name, Stay Off My Operating Table. So lots of places to come find me, and always looking to work with people that are interested in improving their metabolic health and working with a practitioner who does get this.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for your time today. And you are a practitioner of medicine, so we really appreciate you being able to fit us in to educate and evangelize on developments in the field. And thank you, everyone else, for tuning in and listening with us tonight.
Thank you, Doctor.
All right. Thank you guys for doing all that you're doing.
Of course.
Appreciate
Thank you.
it. We'll see you next time.